I'm Bill Scott. I was a flight test engineer working on the Canadair Challenger test and development program back in the late 70s, early 80s. The Canadair Challenger was the first wide-body business jet. It was built by a Canadian company called Canadair. At the time, it is now Bombardier. And the Challenger had a T-tail design, and that is very important to this story, which is about an accident that occurred where we lost this airplane, the first Challenger. So you note the T-tail, and that's related to what we call a deep stall, and that was the cause of the problem on this particular day and accident on April 3rd, 1980. I was one of 4 flight test engineers. I flew about 500 hours on that airplane, and a little background is required here. We were doing some stall tests that were required as part of the certification program, but there was one Department of Transport official, basically the Canadian FAA, that dictated we could not use an electronic stall protection system. No stick pusher, no stall warning of any sort electronic. It had to be an aerodynamic stall. That's the only thing he would accept. Well, the Europeans and Americans had figured out a long time ago that you definitely need an electronic stick pusher, a stick shaker and stick pusher to protect a T-tail type airplane from this deep stall. Nevertheless, we were locked into this program where we had to put a stall strip, a little triangular piece of metal about 1 foot long, on one wing of the airplane to cause that wing to stall before the other one did, give a controlled roll-off. Well, we had a little trouble getting that point. We had to fly a lot of stall flights where we would set that stall strip up, go do a series of tests, come back and move that strip just a few fractions of an inch and go do it again. They were hazardous tests, but Canadair felt like they were locked into it. This is what the certification officials required. So you'll see here that the airplane was highly configured, was highly instrumented. We had a long pitot boom on the nose of this particular airplane, and on that boom were 2 vanes. One was a side slip vane, the other was a stall vane. And those vanes would send signals to the cockpit where we could read instruments and tell what the stall angle of attack was at the time there. But a faulty angle of attack vane or system was directly responsible for the accident I'll be telling you about. We also had a spin chute that was in this blue canister on the very tail end of the airplane. That spin chute, when we attached it to the airplane, we could do that remotely, was there for one reason, and that was if we got into a deep stall, the pilots could activate that chute. The chute would create drag, lift the tail, force the nose down, and return us to controlled flight. The interior of the airplane was, as you can see here, had an awful lot of instruments and equipment in there. This is where I sat as a flight test engineer at that FTE station. Lots of equipment, tape recorder, etc. that we had to run back there. We also had 2 big tanks in the airplane, one forward, one aft in the cabin, where we could pump 1,000 pounds of water back and forth to control the center of gravity. And back in the right corner there, you can see with that arrow, there was a baggage door rigged as an escape hatch, and it had a hydraulic ram on it that once activated, it would just suck that door in. Now on flight 353, that was the one prior to the accident flight, the crew heard a loud banging noise that appeared as they were doing stall tests. And they were so concerned that maybe something had broken, they immediately broke off the test and flew back to Mojave, California, where where the airplanes were based. Mechanics practically tore the airplane apart, but could not find anything that might have been causing that noise. Because the pressures on the program, a program manager came into flight ops 3 different times that afternoon and tried to get Norm Ronison, the test pilot, to take the airplane back out to finish the tests. Norm would say, well, have you checked this? Have you checked that? Well, no. So he sent him back to do that. So late in the day, this was on April 2nd, 1980, there was just Norm and me in the flight ops room. I looked at Norm and said, I don't have your experience, but do you get that funny feeling in your stomach sometimes that something's just not right? Norm said, definitely do. This is one of them. He hesitated a long minute, and he finally said, let's go home. I'll see you tomorrow. So the next day, we briefed early in the morning for flight 354. This was 3 April, 1980. At the end of the briefing, we were told, if you hear that banging noise, try to isolate the cause of it. So we went to the airplane, and Norm Ronison, again, was the test pilot in the left seat. Dave Gollings was the co-pilot in the right, and I was the FTE in the back. Because these were hazardous tests, we were wearing helmets and glider-type security brand parachutes. That was just the norm. Okay, so we're now in the air. We did the standard lock and release of that spin chute system just to verify that it worked okay. Then we started the stall test. We ran through our test guard, and only at one configuration of flaps and gear did we get that banging noise. But we decided to press on to the next one, finish the test card, and then Norm said, let's go back to that particular configuration, get a little more altitude, and he said, we will repeat that stall where we heard the banging noise, which was a bank turn where Norm would pull on the wheel, slow down, increase the angle of attack. But when we got the banging noise, he briefed that he would just hold that angle of attack while I looked around the cabin and see if there was anything loose, broken, whatever. So that's what we did. Norm's flying, Dave's reading off the angle of attack. So we're getting into the banging area, the buffet. I'm looking around the cabin, didn't see anything, but Dave's calling off these angles of attack. So it goes 14, 17, 17. And then all of a sudden, as the banging noise was going on, Dave shouts, 30, more than 34. The angle of attack had just pegged, the gauge had just pegged. I hadn't seen anything moving back there, but as I looked forward, both pilots were pushing full forward on their yokes because clearly we were deep stalled and the nose was not coming down. From my position, I could see only sky. And then slowly I could see a horizon, but nothing more. The nose definitely was not coming down. So Norm called for the spin chute. Dave pressed the switch and the spin chute popped out. We could immediately feel a yanking on the airplane. It was kind of a pulsing feel. The chute out there, the nose pitched down, and we kind of said, all right, we're going home. Norm called for the chute release. Dave pressed another button that should have just activated the hydraulic release system, but it didn't go. Chute was still there. So Dave recycled that system, hit it again, and he said, it didn't go. I'm going to the emergency backup, which was an explosive bolt system that would just blow off the whole mounting plate at the back that the chute was hooked to. So at this point, we're no longer really flying. We're just descending rapidly, belly down, and at a rate that we later determined was on the order of 50,000 feet per minute. So Norm ordered the chute to be cut loose, but nothing happened. Both the hydraulic release and the explosive bolts did not cut that chute loose. At my position, I was watching the altimeter. and it was just unwinding like a broken watch. I hollered 6,000 feet, which meant we were about 4,000 above the ground, and Norm immediately ordered the bailout. So I pitched my pencil, hit the lap belt, and I stood up, and just as I was ready to pull the mic cord to the intercom cord, I heard Norm say what I thought was, "Got it made." And I hesitated a split second, thinking, does he have control of the airplane again? Glanced over, Dave was still taking his straps off, and so I turned around and headed for the back. What we found out later, Norm was making the radio call, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday, Challenger 1 is bailing out." So I ran to the back and knelt on the floor and activated that handle that opened the baggage door, which was, configured as our escape hatch. I was in a duck walk position, crouched in that open doorway, and I could not believe how close the ground was. The sagebrush was going by right smartly. I didn't think I had enough room to even get a good shoot. So I immediately rolled shoulder first out into that blast, and was hit by about 180 knot wind there. And my brain said, "Shut your eyes so you don't lose your contact lenses." So here I didn't know if I had enough altitude to make it, but the contact lenses seemed to be important. My 1001 was pretty quick, pulled the ripcord, got the sharp shock of the chute, and it was so intense that I thought for a second that I had been hit by the spin chute, but then everything got quiet. I looked around, looked up, checked the canopy, no tears, no holes, no lines over. So I had a good canopy, pulled on the riser so where I could turn, and down below me I could see Dave's red and white chute. The canopy was collapsing, so I knew he was down already. I could see the airplane. I was looking at it tail on, and it was descending at about, 30-degree bank, right wing down, and a steep nose down angle. I saw something dark come out the left side. I knew Norm had gotten out, but no chute. And immediately the shadow of the airplane came together with the bird itself, and then bam, the whole airplane exploded. So then it was just converted to this massive orange ball laced in black. And I felt a whomp against my chest as a shock wave hit me, and kind of went into a semi-shock at that point where I said, "Hold it, this isn't working out right. Let's rewind and do this again. This is not the way it's supposed to go." Well, by then, I could see the ground coming up smartly. This was my first jump, so eyes on the horizon, feet together, toes slightly down, hands up high on the risers, and then hit the ground, did a good parachute landing fall, and I was immediately up unstrapping, because I was always concerned out there in the desert that wind would grab that canopy and drag me. But I was almost out of that harness by the time the canopy settled over a creosote bush in front of me. So at that point, I took off running towards the crash site. I found Dave. He was on top of his canopy, and he had broken his leg in 3 places when he hit the ground because he had just barely gotten a good shoot. At that time, we could hear accumulators and other things exploding over at the crash site, so I did not go over there. Dave didn't think Norm got out. I knew he did, but I also knew he didn't get a good shoot. Well, it wasn't long until a helicopter from Edwards Air Force Base was there, stabilized Dave's leg, picked us up, and flew us over to Lancaster. And here you'll see a radar plot that came from Edwards Air Force Base. And the red arrow is where the deep stall occurred. We're around 16,000 feet MSL, which again, about 14,000 feet above the ground. I jumped at where you see the blue arrow, and that's on the order of 1,000, 1,500 feet above the ground. And then the green arrow, that's the impact point. So it was roughly a minute and a half from the time that we entered the deep stall until the crash occurred. Next you see the crash site. The aircraft broke apart and burned, but the tail was broken and somewhat separate. It was outside the burn area. And the next slide here shows that the spin chute was still attached, and it was outside the burn area. You can see that white chute up in the corner there. And then the next one, you'll see that the risers from that chute are still attached to the mounting plates, and that plate should have been blown off by the explosive bolts. So, what are the causes of the accident? What happened? Well, the angle of attack vane stuck just when we were trying to hold a constant angle of attack. Why did it stick? Because that vane came from the manufacturer missing an O-ring. It was just a defect. Nobody knew that, of course, but the airplane set out on the ramp at Mojave, California, where the wind blows a lot, and fine sand had gotten into that stall vane, and it actually scored the race, and the vane decided to stick at just exactly the time that we were trying to hold the constant angle of attack. Spin chute. Both of the anti-spin chute release systems failed. The hydraulic release failed because there was a seal in that system that was not compatible with Skydrol. That's a type of hydraulic fluid we used in the escape system, and is somewhat caustic. That seal had deteriorated to the point where it could not hold pressure, adequate pressure, to activate the release system. We never were really sure why the explosive bolt system didn't work. Later, those bolts did fire properly in the laboratory. The only thing we could figure was that a type of switch that we used, a push-on, push-off switch, may have failed the way we had seen that type of switch fail on other systems in the cockpit. It would perhaps illuminate the light saying the system had been activated, when in fact the system had not been activated. Nevertheless, it didn't work, and that's why we had to get out. Could not get rid of the chute. The banging noise. Engine compressor stalls, like a car backfiring almost, were occurring at that time on the right engine. When we were at high angle of attack, those compressor stalls were such that it would make thrust and then not make thrust very rapidly. Boom, 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 boom. And that engine was translating slightly on the pylon, as it was designed to do, banging the fore and aft stops. That was creating the banging noise. The vibration transferred into the airframe, and that's what we were hearing. We had heard compressor stalls at high altitude, but they were very mild, bump, 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 bump. Whereas down low, there was enough delta thrust from that engine during the compressor stall that it moved the engine and banged the stops. Also contributing to that was Canadair only had one propulsion engineer assigned to the test team there in Mojave, but he didn't have time to look at the data between each flight. And had he been able to, he would have seen that on Flight 353 that those compressor stalls were occurring, and we could have maybe figured out what the banging noise was from that. However, didn't have time to do that. So some contributing factors, you might say, were many. Obviously, flight crew was involved. We were criticized at times. Were you doing a different type of test? No, we were not. We were repeating a previously conducted test, but to a more benign condition, going to just an angle of attack short of stall, and then holding that while we were in at the angle of attack where that banging noise was occurring, just so I'd have a chance to look around the cabin. So that was obviously a factor, but the real reason was, why were we doing this stuff in the first place? And that boiled down to that one Canadian Department of Transport official who had forced us into doing exactly that. We were having to do very hazardous stall testing because one guy one government official decided he was going to reinvent physics, and Canadair management felt like we had no alternative. And of course, because of all this, it was taking much longer to get through the stall test program. Costs were escalating, and the managers said we needed to just, keep the throttles up, fly a lot, because the customers and management equated progress with flight hours. So we were often in the air, not configured properly, but doing the testing that we would have been better off being on the ground re-instrumenting the airplane or something. But there was a lot of pressure from what you might call the money givers. I flew on the order of 700 stalls before the accident and about 500 after, and I was just one of 4 flight test engineers. Before the program was done, we had on the order of 3,000 stalls on the airplane before we got the Canadian certification. And then before we got US FAA certification, we had to fly a bunch more. Instrumentation was a factor. All the onboard test systems and instrumentation had been designed there at Canadair. And to save money, they opted to not put in a telemetry system. Now this would have beamed data by radio down to a ground station, but they chose not to do that. Consequently, all the data was recorded on the airplane itself. So when we lost the airplane, we lost all that flight data. And also, of course, as I mentioned, the engineering staff was pretty thin at Mojave. We were saving money, but we had a great first team, but we had no bench. So the engineers, propulsion, flight sciences, and others really did not have time to go through and properly evaluate the data between flights, just because we were flying so many flights so fast. But on a positive note, we had a really great maintenance team. The mechanics that we had were extremely conscientious, and as an example that, on the day of the accident, Flight 354, one mechanic, Gary Childress, doing his pre-flight work, saw a little puddle of fluid under that escape system in the back of the cabin. So rather than just wipe that little puddle up, he took time to check the system thoroughly and refill the hydraulic reservoir. Now, if he hadn't done that, there's a question of whether that emergency egress system, that escape hatch, would have activated when I fired that handle. And if that hadn't happened, Dave Gollings and I would have gone down with the airplane. So Gary probably saved our life. So what are some of the fixes, some of the lessons learned from all that? Before we restarted the stall test program, Challenger number 2 was outfitted with a redesigned anti-spin chute control system. It was a lot more redundant and a lot more robust than the one we had on number 1. A real-time telemetry system was installed in the airplane, and we set up a ground station where a flight test engineer could monitor any number of different data parameters on the ground. And if he saw something he didn't like, he would just radio push, push, push. Pilots would immediately break off the test, push on the stick, break any stall that we might have been in. Then we'd talk about it, what's going on. And that added another element of safety there. Some of the other lessons that probably could be passed on to other programs was managers really have to develop and institute a set of procedures and policies that enable anybody on the development team, anybody on the test team, to call a halt. If there's something going on they really don't like, they need to speak up, say something that can break the cycle, break the chain of events that often leads to an accident and people die. But everybody's going to have that, because people get involved in this program and everybody is very busy. But somebody has to be able to say, we're approaching what I call zero margin. That great safety margin we always build in at the start of a test program can very easily get whittled down to where you're approaching zero margin, and that's when bad things happen. somebody has to be able to step back, and everybody on the team should be doing this all the time and saying, hey, are we missing something? Are we pushing too hard? Are people getting tired? And are we giving it our best? So finally, the Challenger was certified, both in Canada and in the United States, and it's now one of the primary business jets that's out there flying. There have been any number of models that evolved from that, even regional jets, as well as several models of the Challenger. So it turned into a very effective, highly competitive business jet that's serving a lot of people around the world. And I would like to close with one point. It's important to note that there was nothing wrong with the Challenger business jet, with the Challenger airplane itself. The fault that caused this accident was in the instrumentation. So it was in the flight test instrumentation. And there were several things that just weren't right there. So people on other programs, pay close attention to the instrumentation. That can get you just as fast as something wrong with the airplane itself. Challenger is certified, flying now. It's a great airplane. So that's the story of the Canadair Challenger #1 accident. Thank the Western Museum of Flight for the opportunity to share this story, and hopefully it'll become part of the history that anybody can see at this museum. Thank you.